Siragusa with Dojo Live. Today is Wednesday, July 15th, 2020, tax day for those of you who haven't filed. How fun. Welcome to the show. I'm broadcasting from Los Angeles, and I am joined today by my co-host and co-producer, Carlos Ponce from just outside Mexico City. Welcome, Carlos. Here we go. One more time.
One more time, Tulio. Thank you.
And today we have a guest, Reid Blackman, who is the founder and CEO of Virtue. Hi, Reid. Pleasure to have you on the show. Reid is dialing in from Brooklyn, New York. Tell us about yourself a little bit. Love to get the audience to learn about who Reid is.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So my name is Reid Blackman. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Virtue. It's an ethics consultancy. So a little bit about myself. My main background is in philosophy. So I was a philosophy professor for a decade prior to leaving academia, leaving the ivory tower, and starting an ethics consultancy. What I really care about is ethics, helping people infuse ethics into their businesses, into operations, into product development, and that sort of thing.
Interesting. Well, welcome to the show. We're looking forward to having this conversation.
I'm sure you've already had a slew of philosophers on your show.
I mean, aren't we all? But
Yeah.
no, but we love hearing from academia, ex-academia, because you bring an aspect of things that sometimes we haven't thought of, and that's
Sure.
valuable, right? But tell us about Virtue. What does the company do? What gave birth to this idea? Please give us a little background on the company.
Yeah, sure. So the company itself is about operationalizing ethics, especially operationalizing digital ethical risk mitigation. So a lot of companies are they're gathering mass troves of data. They're using that data often to train their machine learning algorithms. And there are all sorts of well-documented ethical and reputational risks that people are familiar with, right? Privacy violations, black box algorithms, discriminatory algorithms, and so on and so forth. There's lots of problems, right? So the thing is that most people, not non-culpably, don't have a very firm grip on how to think about ethics in a business context. How do you systematically identify those ethical risks? And then how do you go about systematically mitigating them? And so that's where someone like me comes in. I've been thinking about researching, publishing, teaching on ethics for 20 years. And so we can come in and create a digital ethics program and then scale that throughout the organization.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more. I love the comment you made. You know, sometimes people don't necessarily follow ethics, not of the fault of their own or on purpose. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that. But why don't we just go right into it?
Yeah.
Carlos, what's the topic that Reid has chosen today? Let's go right into the conversation, see where this takes us.
Absolutely, Tulio. Thank you so much, and thanks, Reid, for being here. Today, Tulio, we're going to be speaking about operationalizing data and AI ethics, and we're going to be answering the question of how does ethical data or AI mitigate risk and create efficiency. So, Reid, tell us about this. Why did you choose this particular topic, and why did you think it was relevant for today's show?
So it's the thing that I care about the most, and it's the thing that led me to leave academia. So, I said I was in academia for 20 years, quite a long time, professor for 10 of those years. Before that, of course, I was a grad student and an undergrad. And what made me leave academia was seeing companies doing all sorts of unethical things, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and knowing that it matters to their businesses that they're doing these things. This first, became obvious when Cambridge Analytica broke out, right? And we had #DeleteFacebook. And then there are other kinds of social movements, most obviously Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. But then you also saw engineers ringing the alarm bells around artificial intelligence or machine learning and all the kinds of massive societal impacts that are going on there. And I thought, oh, there's actually really big problems here. There's society impacting, there are ethical issues, of course, that I've based my entire career on. And they're business risks at this point. They're not just sort of PR disasters, because we have a lot of people who really care about whether companies are conducting themselves in an ethical manner, whether they're building and deploying products in an ethical way. And that's somewhere where I thought I could help. So, and then it turns out to, not quite to my surprise, but to my happiness, that ethics runs really deep with a lot of people. They almost surprisingly, they care about it a lot. And I think people don't really know how to take that concern and drive it into their business operations. And so I think that's the place where I can help. And so that's why, you asked what do I like to talk about? That's the kind of thing that I like to talk about. One, because I think it speaks to a need and a desire that individuals and businesses have, and it speaks to my expertise.
Excellent. So what are some examples of companies that have failed miserably like this, that has triggered the need to bring in someone like yourself, for example, to help establish ethical standards for the organization? Love to just hear some examples of what could be a sort of red flag triggering the need for this, because there may be some companies that are doing some things but they're not aware, like you said. So if they're listening, love to just at least bring awareness to a couple of examples of like red flags that people ought to think about. Hey, it's time for you to put in place some ethics and standards in place. Please share some stories if you could.
Yeah, sure. I'll focus on the data and take IBM. So IBM has collected a lot of data with their weather app, and IBM is now being sued by the city of Los Angeles, where you are right now. So your city is suing IBM for misappropriation of the data that they collected with their weather app. Collected in things that they shouldn't have collected, allegedly. Things they used in various ways they shouldn't have used in that ways, again, allegedly. But there's a real concern by the city of Los Angeles that the data of its citizens was misappropriated, and so now they have a lawsuit on their hands. Optum Healthcare was in the news. I think it was this past December, so not that long ago. They were in the news because they are being investigated by regulators for having an AI algorithm that allegedly discriminates against Black people. More specifically, it is an algorithm that makes recommendations to doctors and nurses about what patients to pay attention to. And allegedly, the algorithm recommended that doctors and nurses pay more attention to white patients than to sicker Black patients. That's a pretty classic case, standard case of biased or discriminatory algorithms in machine learning. And quick note, this doesn't have to be intentional. In a lot of these cases in which the vast majority of which there's bias or discrimination built into an algorithm, it's done so unintentionally with no particular or explicitly biased attitudes on the part of the developers, the product managers, or anything of the sort. Amazon was in the news because they actually had to junk their AI hiring software, which systematically discriminated against women. Goldman Sachs is being investigated by regulators for allegedly discriminating against women in determining a credit limit for the Apple Card, but using AI to determine credit limits. Anyway, there's, what did I just give you, 4 or 5 examples?
Wow. So in some cases, most of these algorithms are set up by data scientists, by technical folks who are just trying to create models to extrapolate and extract data to create intelligence that can be used for some kind of smart business execution. I can totally see where someone well-intentioned is like, well, the more data we have, there's a pattern that's emerging. Based on this pattern, this is what we recommend. And unfortunately, sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So if you're the kind of business, what I'm hearing is if you're in the kind of business where you're collecting consumer data or any kind of behavior data from consumers, then you probably ought to look at how you're going to apply it so that you don't unnecessarily create an environment where you could be construed as like, hey, the algorithm is actually having a bias towards a certain group of people, even though it wasn't intended to do that. So what are some of the steps a company should think about in terms of how they weave this into their product roadmap, their actual product strategy? What are some, because I never hear someone say, oh, let's stop and look at this now, right? Where does that come in? Where do you suggest that begins to become a discussion during the product life cycle?
Yeah, so great question. Really, really great question. And I'll say why it's such a great question, because it immediately reveals why the standard approach to these issues doesn't work. So you take, for instance, a lot of the big tech companies, the first thing that they did, Google, for example, they came out with their AI ethics principles, and there are loads of these principles all around. We're for fairness, we're for accountability, we're for transparency, blah, blah, blah. But these principles, because they're so vague, they don't get operationalized. They don't get built into workflow for product developers. And so your question is exactly the right one. It's the question that most of the tech community has failed to ask. They're beginning to, I can say more about this if you like, they're beginning to sort of catch on to this and figure out, trying to work on how to operationalize these things, but it's still very early days. It's going to be a lot about process and practice, right? So for instance, the product managers have to play a certain kind of role in this. They have to be financially incentivized to play a role. They have to figure out what the standards are, and then talk about those standards with the developers and make sure that it gets built into the product. It needs to be built into the product lifecycle. So when you're just at the concept phase, start thinking about the ways in which you can ethically screw things up. So there needs to be a kind of due diligence process. A lot of people like to talk about ethical checklists. But then, of course, it's not about whether the checklist is created, it's how it was created. So was it created with the input of the developers? Is the checklist tailored to the needs of those people who are making that particular kind of product, where this kind of approach to fairness is appropriate, but that kind of approach is not? Does that begin to answer your question?
Yeah, I'm starting to kind of get a picture. I was thinking to myself, even in an agile environment, right? So someone's developing the stories for their sprint, for the week or the next 2 weeks. And in that, there's the design, there's development, then there's QA, right? There's all these practices to ensure good quality code. But what I'm hearing is somewhere in there, someone needs to start inserting an ethics review. Yeah. But in order to effectively do that, you'd have to put in place what those ethics need to look like. So what are the steps? How does a company prepare themselves in order to then put those processes in place?
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, there's a bunch of things. So first, you have to get a kind of ethics framework, right? So, what are the values that we're actually going to strive to realize, or in my view, more importantly, what are the disvalues we want to avoid, right? What are the ethical nightmare situations that invite lawsuits, regulatory investigations, loss of consumer trust, et cetera? So what are those things? Who are the stakeholders involved? Whose welfare do we really want to focus on here? And do we want to make sure not to harm? And then let's make sure that trickles down to when we're developing the product. So, let me give you a slightly more concrete example, right? So we talked about those those discriminatory algorithms or biased algorithms. One of the problems there is that one way that bias creeps into the system is that the data set doesn't resemble, say, the general population in the right sort of way, right? So you've got some facial recognition software, you train it on 1 million white faces and 100 black faces. It's going to turn out it's really bad at recognizing black faces and really good at recognizing white faces, so on and so forth, right? So you want to make sure that you have a sort of balanced and a data set that represents the population well. So one thing that you're going to want is you're going to want the developers to talk to the data collectors and say, hey, listen, this is the kind of product that we want to build. We're going to need the data that we need to train our model on. It has to look like this. Here's how we think about what a balanced and fairly, good representation of the data set looks like. So that's the kind of thing that we need you to go out and get. Right, so because otherwise the data collectors will just hoover up as much data as they possibly can, and then give the modelers as much data as they have, and then those modelers will just take all that data and train their algorithm. And because there's no intentionality there, you're going to get bias built in. But if the developers think about the ways in which the data sets might be biased from the outset and can have a conversation with the data collectors about it, and there's a explicit process by which that conversation is, there's a place where that conversation has to go in the course of product development, then you're ensuring that that conversation happens and that the data collectors are sensitive to the kinds of data that they're collecting and how they're cleaning it, so on and so forth. Does that help? Let me just say one more thing. And it's not as though you can just say, make sure that the data is fair, that the data is unbiased. Because different ways of measuring fairness will be appropriate for different kinds of applications. So statistical parity might be really important when you're talking about, say, hiring. Let's say you're pushing out job ads, and you want to make sure that it doesn't just show those good jobs, high-paying jobs, whatever, to white people, that people of color also see those job ads. So then you might want something like statistical parity, that the percentages of the populations are reflected in who actually gets to see those ads. But that metric of fairness doesn't make any sense if you're doing something like image captioning, right? That's not relevant. And so different kinds, and so when you're doing things like, you don't want it to be the case that all the pictures of doctors are men and all the pictures of nurses are women. That's what some people call an associative bias. But the notion of statistical parity is going to be relevant there. And so when you create conceptions of what constitutes fairness, it's often going to have to be at a per product, or at least per product category level. And then it'll have to be tailored to the individual products that are being made.
It's very interesting observation. I know you have a question. I just want to make an interesting comment. I've been an advisor to a couple of AI companies in the past, and that never crossed anybody's mind. It was always, the algorithm and the machine will learn and come up with the outcome. So, the mindset's been, well, you're removing the ego out of it because the machine's doing the work. But what I'm hearing is, without, telling the machine to be cognitive of the fact that it could, to avoid certain biases, then you're kind of leaving it a potluck, which creates a risk.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so look, a lot of the ways that what does machine learning do? Essentially, it's a pattern recognizer, right? So why did Amazon's machine learning software discriminate against women? Well, because it took it took 10,000 resumes over the past 10 years or whatever it was, and those resumes were tagged, led to a hire, didn't lead to a hire, and then the machine recognized a certain pattern. We hire men, we don't hire women. And so it started taking out, as it were, red lighting the resumes that were women's resumes. For instance, I might read the resume, using NLP, and it says NCAA women's basketball, and so that thing gets red lighted. Now, why is it that Amazon tended to hire more men than women? There are a variety of explanations. One is, yes, there's just sort of, there's bias in the hiring system generally. That's one explanation. The other is, you might say, more societal, that there are more men in STEM fields than there are women. And so there's going to be a lot more men in the pool of candidates. And so, of course, more men are going to get hired. But the algorithm just interprets that as, the thing that we do is hire more men than women, or we don't really hire women, we hire men. So that's just some bias in the data set that gets unintentionally reflected in the model. And then there's a question about, okay, well, what's the strategy for mitigating the risk? Do we now go and do we want to reassess our data set? Do we want to reassess our model? Do we want to change the objective function? What's the thing that we should do to mitigate those biases? And now you need a process by which the potential strategies are identified, the various probabilities of effectiveness and the cost of those strategies is assessed, and then a decision is made about which strategy to pursue. And that gets handed back to the developers to say, okay, here's how you should go about mitigating those biases.
Reid, I got a question, and this is more of an personal education nature for me, because I haven't been like Tulio. Tulio's been around for forever, like more than 3 decades in technology, and I haven't. So my question is this: ever since you've been in business with Virtue, and well, I understand that your focus is helping companies integrating ethics in the development and deployment of even emerging technology. In this context, along the journey that you've taken, have you ever seen any kind of product that was intended to be deployed and had to be stopped stone cold because there was some issue with the ethics and everything, pretty much everything that you're talking about, for any reason whatsoever? You don't have to say any any brands or names, but specific things that happened as an anecdotally that you can share with us and with the audience, so that maybe we can be on the lookout?
Yeah,
my grandmother used to say, "Reveal the sin, not the sinner."
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, so look, usually if someone is working with me, then they already have a sense that there is something going on, right? It's usually, oh, we're aware of these risks. We started to see these risks. We've seen people raising questions about it. The engineers are raising concerns, and so of course, I've seen certain things come along. Usually, when I get involved, sometimes I get involved at the product level. That certainly happens, where I'll help them work through product development and deployment. What best practices are for deployment, and also, hey, what are the features that you should or should not include in here from an ethics perspective? And what are the ways that you can, more responsibly develop this product, say train the model? So that happens. A lot of times when I get involved, though, it's more along the lines of, we don't know what we don't know. We're collecting a ton of data. We are building, machine learning applications, models, and we've had these ethics issues sort of pop up here and there, and frankly, we don't have a way of attacking that problem. So we want to go about doing it systematically. How do we build out a data ethics risk program? And that's where I come in. So because I'm not standardly embedded in a team or embedded in a company deeply, it's not that I see someone pull the cord on some particular product.
Okay.
But that's going on for sure.
Interesting. I mean, it sounds to me that VCs or investors probably have that question in their checklist, in their due diligence checklist. If you're investing in an AI company or a company that's, it sounds to me that would be appropriate to begin to ask those questions. Do you have an ethics standard? How are you going to handle this? Because the last thing you want to do is invest in a company that has a lot of promise. The data works, the algorithm works, but the outcomes reveal something that causes a lawsuit and unintentionally causes bias, which could have been avoided by simply having a question that says, what's your standard? And if you don't have one, let's put one in place to avoid that from happening. How many companies are proactively doing that? Are VCs proactively doing that? Are you seeing that pattern, or is that something like it's early days and this is part of the educational process to bring awareness to this issue?
Yeah, great question. So I don't think VCs are doing this. I think they ought to. They should, for purely self-interested reasons. To your point, they don't want their investment blowing up. One suspects that if there had been a proper ethical due diligence, if SoftBank had done a proper ethical due diligence, they wouldn't have wound up with a bomb on their hands. But they're not. Partly that might be because they're risk takers by nature, right? Venture capitalists are into the risk game. And on the other side of the coin, the startups, they're not incentivized to do it either. They're incentivized to develop an MVP and start getting enterprise clients as soon as possible, in part to satisfy those investors, right? So it's harder in the startup world. I've worked with startups, but they don't always have the budget for it, and the VCs are not pushing it. The places where we're seeing a lot of action is actually the big tech companies, unsurprisingly. So Microsoft is probably the most aggressive on this. They've got a number of departments within that are working on both research. They're doing research on operationalizing AI ethics, data ethics, etc. They're working on, and they actually have practitioners who are working on operationalizing it. I think it's still early there, but at least they have, they have like one department called the Ethics and Society Division, and I think they have something like 24 people working there. Facebook recently set up a responsible innovation program. Recently, less than a year, but they're from what I understand, and I know the people who are running it. They're doing a lot of hiring, and they're trying to be very active on this. Twitter is getting into the game. They're working on machine learning ethics and integrating that into product development. Very early for them, but the big tech companies, there's no doubt that they're doing it. And they're actually putting, for them, not a lot of money, but putting together relatively substantial, by most other companies' measures, pretty substantial teams. So I would say that most of the activity that is by the big tech companies, and then there are other companies, of course, the ones, for instance, that I work with, who are not necessarily massive tech companies, but they're dealing with a tremendous amount of data, building ML, et cetera. And so they're beginning to pay quite a bit of attention.
Well, that's good news. I mean, most of the founders of the startups come from some of those big tech companies, so hopefully they'll bring those standards with them as they move forward. Yeah. Any plan? So today, how do you go about sniffing out those challenges? Is this a manual process? Do you have some kind of a software that goes in and looks for these anomalies? Is that potentially something that could be developed? How does the company proactively check against its algorithm to say, hey, is this following, good ethical standards? Is it manually done, or is there software to do that today?
Yeah, so it varies. I mean, look, essentially, what we go in, we can do a gap analysis. You can do a risk analysis, right? It's not you can't just run a piece of software to see what it is that they're doing. The thing that's really important here that I sort of mentioned, and in fact you mentioned it, is that you really have to dovetail this stuff with existing infrastructure. Like, you just can't, if it's just sort of its own thing separate from, say, cyber practices or data governance practices, then it's less likely to work, right? So ideally, there's already things in place where you can start. So for instance, if a company has a data governance program, which often includes a data governance board, that's a great place to start. Okay, you're the data governance board, you're already dealing with certain kinds of risks, right? Cyber risks, for instance, legal risks, regulatory risks. So if you're already dealing with those kinds of risks, let's look at the framework that you're using in order to vet those risks, to have those conversations, to make those decisions. And let's fold into the kinds of considerations that the conversations you're already having, a layer of ethical due diligence. Let's fold it in there. And if you need a framework to add on to the framework that you already have, then we'll help you build that out. And once that's built out, then you can see, okay, let's do a sort of gap analysis or risk analysis of where we need to infuse this ethics framework, and then build a strategic roadmap and start executing on it.
Sounds to me like if you're serving on a board and you're leading the ethics committee, this is definitely something you want to have in there as a checklist item or a to-do for the organization to get behind. We're coming up on time, Reid. It's been great. It's been very educational. I certainly got a lot out of it, and it made me realize, if you ever build an AI company, this is definitely something to put in place to do the right thing from the get-go. So we're coming up on time. Tell us a little bit about what it's been like for you making that transition from academia into the business world. Anything you've learned throughout that process about yourself, about becoming an entrepreneur, that you'd like to share with the audience as we wrap up?
That's a great question. I mean, since I was in academia for so long, we ask, what's amazing about academics is that we go after questions and we answering those questions in a very systematic way and in an exhaustive way. That's what we're really good at. The problem is that most academics most ethicists, philosophers, ask irrelevant questions to businesses, because the questions that academics are asking are usually things like, should we do this? Would it be a good idea to build this kind of product or whatever? Is it good for society, whatever? Which is a great question to ask, but most businesses are not asking that question. They're asking, given that we're going to do this, how can we do it in a way that mitigates risk? And the problem is that when they standardly confront the kinds of ethical issues that companies are getting in trouble for, they don't know how to systematically identify and then mitigate those risks, because ethical risk is, in the context that we're talking about, is not something that they've ever been trained to do. And so what's really been interesting for me is to marry the systematicity and rigor of academic inquiry with the sort of practical relevance of business needs. And that's what I've found both sort of educational for myself, but also extremely interesting to see that's how you can really get successful operationalizing of ethics.
What an amazing journey from theory to practice, and realizing the gaps between the two. Great lesson to have shared. It's been a pleasure to have you, Reid, on the show.
Yeah, my
We're
pleasure.
up on time. It's been very educational. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, stay with us as we wrap up. We have one more show tomorrow on Thursday.
Yes, we do.
We actually, someone who joined us on the recap show on Monday
Right.
a couple of weeks ago. By the way, if you're watching this and you've seen any of the shows this past week, you can join us on Monday on the recap show. We would love to have you be one of the peoples right here in the video, just providing your input. We're welcoming guests and audiences to participate on the recap show on Monday. It's 10 minutes. That's all we do, is a quick recap of all the shows. What do we got coming up tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific again?
Tomorrow, Tulu, we're going to be speaking with Sammy James, the CEO of Speak to Leads, a sales automation platform. And the topic is going to be, I like the name, because it's the squiggly path to success. So let's see how that turns out. We're going to be speaking about his 10 years of failures, as he, quote unquote, 10 years of failures, fear, and finding our way. So that's tomorrow. And also, of course, as Tulio mentioned, Monday, we're going to be recapping this conversation with Reid, and the one from yesterday and the one from tomorrow. So join us on Monday at 1 p.m. Pacific, right here, Dojo Live.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.